it's high, high, hey, the army's on its way. Hello, front page is out and strong. For wherever we go, you will always know that the army goes rolling along.
Hi, welcome to Pegasus Research Substack Week in Review, Unscripted number 46 podcast. I am Thomas, the founder of and the author for Pegasus Research. I'm an economist, military historian, and a U.S. Army veteran. If you like my content and want to support my work, please consider becoming a subscriber on Substack or a follower, or you can provide one-time support on Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, or Ko-fi. The website will be in the description section of this podcast. So welcome everybody who is returning this, and for all new people that have first time hearing this, this is a, call it my extemporaneous thoughts on the three main articles that I write during the week on Substack. Main articles always come out on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and usually follow-ups with the next day with a full video file and a full audio file of me narrating the content. So again, this is just my extemporaneous thoughts on things that I've already written. Some of it seems to make sense and some of it seems to be me rattling on, but we'll see how it goes today. So the three articles this week is Russia bemoans NATO's decision to protect undersea cables, NASA sets criteria for next space station, is it time for the U.S. Navy to reconsider the supercarrier? All right, so the first one is Russia bemoans NATO's decision to protect undersea cables. This is based on the number of attacks that they've seen, or what's being considered hybrid attacks, to undersea water cables in the Baltic Sea. The Baltic Sea is basically, has been described of, and can be, well, I think this is probably a legitimate description, a NATO lake. I think there's, if I remember right, the count is 9 countries are in the Baltic region, and 8 of them are in NATO. The other one is Russia. So the number of attacks have happened where undersea cables, both power cables and data cables, have been cut in the Baltic Sea. And at the time I wrote this article, or the day after I wrote this article, I think just before it was released or just after it was released, there was another attack on a Swedish power, I don't know if it was a power line, I think it was a data cable. So it's ongoing. Now there's concern this week that there is a Russian ship that is monitoring activities in the Baltic Sea. Not sure if that's related to the exercise I'm about to discuss here, or if that's scoping out future attacks. Of course, Russia denies that these attacks are intentional, and Russia has not carried out these attacks as far as it's not a government ship doing it. It's it could be a Russian owned but flagged by a different country ship. One of them was an oil tanker that's part of this a black fleet of oil tankers to help skirt around sanctions. I kind of doubt that's really skirting around sanctions, because NATO knows about these Black Fleet tankers and don't really do anything about it. So it's like, I don't know how much of that is really skirting around sanctions or not. Another one was conducted by a Chinese ship visiting a Russian port. And then there's been other ones of Russian ships doing this. So it's not Russian ships doing it, but that also means that there's a set of plausible deniability that these are just accidents. And that's one of the tough things about hybrid warfare, is how do you separate true intent with something that is, could you say that is plausibly innocent or a plausible accident and not truly a hybrid attack? That's one of the tough things about hybrid warfare. And then the reaction to it is a real challenge. So on December 25th, this is when I wrote the article, on December 25th, 2024, undersea cables in the Baltic Sea were cut by Russia and their allies in a suspected hybrid attack. So this is kind of the last straw for NATO, because they have seen a number of these attacks escalating and seems to be becoming more common. Hard to say if they're an accident, because especially it's hard to say it's an accident when you have a prior to the Ukraine war, the number of times this happened, and after the Ukraine war, there is quite an uptick in the number of occurrences that this happens. Now, the occurrences aren't not that often just after the Ukraine war. It's been something that's really been speeding up as NATO pushes more and more red lines, and it causes Russia to respond to those red lines. And that's one of my arguments, thesis, if you will, about these red lines is NATO feels self-assured, or the West feels self-assured that they can push. Russia sets a red line for something that they don't want the West to do to provide in the war to Ukraine. The West kind of abides by it to a point, and then they cross it. And then they have this sense of self-assuredness that, no, nothing's happened. So Russia's red lines are just bluffs, and that we can just keep blowing through all these red lines. And my argument is, yeah, that might have been at the beginning, but Russia has been responding. They just don't respond directly, which is one of the things is Russia kind of makes a direct threat on the red line. The West blows past the red line. They don't see a direct response from the Russians. So they think, okay, Russia's big bluff, we'll just do it. Just keep blowing through red lines as they're created. Now, what Russia is doing is they do things like destabilization. Like they went to some red line was crossed. I think it was the F-16s, but I'm not 100% sure on that. So the West blows past a red line from Russia. They don't see anything happen, but lo and behold, at the United Nations Security Council, Russia stops basically the sanctions against North Korea's missile program, and their nuclear program. So all monitoring has ended because in the Security Council, Russia used to be a strong supporter of nuclear non-proliferation. And they were a supporter in the UN Security Council of having these sanctions. And then the way the sanctions were is the sanctions actually required monitoring. And without the monitoring, there could be no sanctions because you couldn't sit there and say if the North Koreans were breaking or following the sanctions. Well, the West blows past a Russian red line, and lo and behold, when the renewal comes up for that sanction monitoring of North Korea, Russia uses its veto and vetoes the renewal of the monitoring. So in effect, ended the sanctions. Another red line is crossed. So what does Russia do? They go out and they sign a defense treaty with North Korea, and lo and behold, now we have North Korean troops in Ukraine. I'll be writing a little bit about that tomorrow. So this is just my example is that Russia does not respond directly. They respond, I'll call it obliquely. They are, I don't know if you could really call this a red line, but they're talking more and more about bringing NATO or Turkey into BRICS. Turkey is a NATO country. It would give the Russians an inside track into politics in the NATO alliance, allegedly, but it definitely brings an option. So the red lines that have been crossed, the reaction from Russia is to act in a destabilizing manner in the world. And so you look at it like, why is the world a lot more tense than what it was prior to the Ukraine war? And a lot of it is, of course, the war in itself, the biggest war in Europe since World War II, but also the fact is that the reaction cycle, which right now is only in a case of escalation, is every reaction from the West and every action from the West and every reaction from the Russians is just an escalation. So that's where the fact is that maybe it's a slow boil escalation. It's not like, okay, everybody's, the West is firing and Russia's firing nuclear missiles at each other. It's not that level of escalation, but it is slowly escalating. And in fact, I don't put a lot into this, not as much as I used to. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, when they used to just look at nuclear war, but now they've tied in climate change and some other criteria outside of nuclear war. So they've kind of diluted their message because what does an atomic scientist a Bulletin of Atomic Science is meant to monitor the nuclear threat in the world, and this has been around since the Cold War. And I felt they were a fairly accurate, maybe a little bit sensationalistic magazine, but they had some credibility. But now they added in other factors that make them less credible. But one of the factors they do state is the nuclear threat of the ongoing Ukraine war, and so they actually moved themselves up from, I think, from 90 seconds to midnight to 89 seconds. So not a big change, but a change in itself. And I believe they look at this every month, if I remember. I know that's what they used to do. I assume they still do in that magazine. So yes, there is a real feel that the tension levels in the world have gone up. And that's because the polarization or the bipolarization of the world, just similar to the Cold War. The Chinese argue it's not bipolarization, it's multipolarization. They probably have somewhat of a point if they don't consider themselves part of the Russian bloc, but they act as a Russian bloc. So I guess if you want to sit there and say it's a multipolar world in the Chinese perspective, you have you have the West, you have Russia, and then you have China. But China has this no friends or no, what do they call it there, no limits friendship with Russia, and they act as a almost in lockstep with the Russians. So it's like they feel like that's one camp in itself. So if you want to go into argue three camps, I guess you could go into argument that it's West, the China-Russian axis, and probably the non-aligned countries, which would include countries like India, would be the biggest. So, okay, I got off subject. Sorry about that. So, NATO, in response to all these undersea cable cutting, which again I argue is part of those reactions to the red lines, is NATO initiated something called an operation, or I'll call it an operation and not an exercise. I think I actually put an exercise in the paper, but it's really an operation because it's ongoing. It's not like an exercise like the old Reforger exercise, which goes on for 6 weeks and then ends. This has no end date, and it's got a specific mission in its scope. So after the November 25th attack, NATO in January initiated Baltic Sentry with the goal of preventing further attacks on the infrastructure of its member states for infrastructure located on the Baltic floor. NATO clarified its role by stating that it's not actually going to serve as they will not stop the attack. So they're basically serving the surveillance assets and then coordinating with the national states along the Baltic. Again, 8 of which are NATO, and that would work with those countries' navies and law enforcement activities to help monitor and, if necessary, stop activities that might lead to, or if a infrastructure was damaged or destroyed, that they would monitor to a point of allowing the nations to come make us stop. For example, if the actions that happened in Finland waters or the Finnish infrastructure that was cut, NATO would notify Finland, and they would keep monitoring of the ship suspected of it until Finnish authorities arrive. But NATO says they would not actually perform a stop, but they would assist in the stop, whatever that means. So this is basically NATO's reaction to hybrid warfare, is just to create an coordination between the states, mainly the militaries and coast guards, in some cases also law enforcement, and to increase the amount of surveillance. So they've created a web of surveillance in the area. Now, it also includes both manned and unmanned naval surface assets, not undersea, not like submarines, not anyone's been reported as, but they've dedicated naval assets. Now, one of the strange things that makes why it would drive suspicions of the activities is the naval units are predominantly, the NATO naval units are predominantly located in the Gulf of Finland and parts of the northern parts of the Baltic Sea, leading into Leningrad. So it's almost like there's where the naval assets are basically monitoring Russian activities coming into and out of the port around Leningrad, but they are largely naval-wise ignoring Kaliningrad. I think there is obviously Poland has close eyes, and I think it's Lithuania also has close eyes on Kaliningrad, Sweden as well. So there is a lot of monitoring around Kaliningrad, but the NATO naval surface assets are actually in the Gulf of Finland and just outside of the Gulf of Finland in the northeastern part of the Baltic Sea. So, but this is basically NATO's response, is just to create a sense of deterrence and monitoring and coordination to help prevent this type of attacks from occurring. Now, my argument is that, and this will be the second paragraph I've actually mentioned it, is that a military solution to hybrid warfare, and I would argue, I'll go basically set the table on this one. And I'll bring it up more, so I'll keep repeating it, but I think it's probably good I bring it up. I'm looking at my notes here, so it's just my note. I have notes to kind of keep me somewhat on track. Is when you're looking at sabotage, and that's what you can argue with these cutting of cable lines are. If you do not accept the premise that these are accidents, and I do have I've been pretty doubtful about the reactions within the Ukraine war, but I think it's based just looking at statistical probability and statistical occurrences before 2024, between 2022 and 2024. And then prior to 2022, and this is all tied into the Ukraine invasion and the crossing of the red lines, there is a statistical factor or a statistical change that shows that it is unlikely that these are just strictly accidental, because the occurrences are much past what you would expect in a statistical probability. So I'm not talking about this is all of a sudden they see more attacks and they're putting more media focus on. For example, would be after in the U.S., the East Palestine train derailment and reaction to, which was well, I won't go much into politics, but a poor reaction from the government on that one. But after that happened, every train derailment received scrutiny from the press. Hey, there's another derailment. And so all of a sudden you felt like, as a watcher of media, is like, oh, what's happened? All these derailments. What's going on with the railroads? And then you look at the statistical probabilities. It hadn't really changed. It's just one derailment all of a sudden brought focus on it and just brought reporting on things that were not to the extent, obviously, of East Palestine, but train derailments are common. So it was all of a sudden a case where it's like the case where when you looked at the statistical data in the U.S. of train derailments after East Palestine and before East Palestine, it was basically unchanged. That's not what you see in the hybrid attacks going on in the Baltic. They did happen, but not at the occurrence. And also when it did happen, the damage was relatively minor compared to the damage that you're seeing, where you're seeing complete cuts in these data cables, or enough so that the cable, if it's a data transmission, it shuts down. If it's carrying electricity, it shuts down. So the number of attacks and the damage of the attacks are much greater now than what you've seen in the past. So even though I do take a sense of skepticism when looking at these reporting, is the statistical probabilities tell me that this is not purely accidental. So NATO is responding with a military response, but my argument going back into it is sabotage has typically, and you go back to the Cold War periods and before, sabotage outside of active war was always considered a law enforcement function, just like espionage was. You didn't send the military out to stop sabotage. it was again a law enforcement function. And most of these states in the Baltic still treat it as a law enforcement function. It is their prosecutors being involved. It's their Coast Guard. Coast Guard plays much more of a law enforcement function than a military function, though some of them are under their ministries of defense. In the U.S., it's not under the Department of Defense. It's under a separate organization. I think it's under Homeland Security. But again, the typical response to sabotage, which I classify these attacks or these damages to these undersea infrastructure as sabotage, fell under purview of law enforcement function. But NATO is not a law enforcement function. It is a military alliance. Now, it does have a political side of it, but it doesn't, even on the political side, it does not have a law enforcement function. But it is being pulled in, a military organization is being pulled in to perform what would normally be classified as law enforcement functions. Now, yes, those assets that are given, that NATO uses, obviously can provide a great level of surveillance and can help as a force multiplier, if you want to call it that, for law enforcement. Be able to provide them with their limited resources, law enforcement's limited resources, to be able to say where the likely events could occur, when they occur, and tracking down the culprit, because NATO is right there on the scenes, either with unmanned assets, through surveillance assets, or through surveillance, both air and sea and space. So they have a way to track all this. So military assets can be used for the help in law enforcement functions, but again, it's not really a law enforcement function. But so Baltic Sentry, in my argument, is that it is performing a law enforcement function and outside of what the military purview is. Now, the other goes into this is NATO is somewhat classifying this as an exercise, although it is more like an operation. It has not been subject to unanimous consent. So I'm not sure how NATO, what rules and bylaws they're using to avoid being involved in this. It would be one thing if NATO countries lent their Navy or basically they let their Navy serve and help each other, basically create their own joint task force and act on their, let's say it's 8 NATO countries decide that, okay, we're going to combine our assets to monitor the region, but they're not pulling in NATO. That would be, again, that would be different. That would not require any type of vote from NATO. But NATO has gotten himself involved in an operation outside of Leningrad with no consent from the organization itself. Now, the fact that nobody's protesting this tells me that there might be some way they're getting around this. It just seems odd that they're doing this. So it's like two things seem odd. NATO involved in a law enforcement function, NATO having not gone through a consent process to perform this operation. And again, it'd be one thing if they're patrolling the Baltic Sea, but for the most part, their surface assets, again, are parked outside of Leningrad. I mean, not right outside the Leningrad, but they're in the Gulf of Finland, and the only way to get to the ports around Leningrad, I just can't believe I just did that. Leningrad is St. Petersburg. Leningrad was the old name. That was the World War II names. But to my defense, Putin reactivated the Leningrad military district around St. Petersburg. I'm sorry, all references to Leningrad, if I'm not saying Leningrad military district, all references to Leningrad is St. Petersburg. The only way to get to St. Petersburg is through the Gulf of Finland, and that's where NATO is concentrating its surface assets for the Baltic Sentry operation. So again, NATO is serving in what would be traditionally a law enforcement function, and they're doing so on a risky operation outside of the ports around St. Petersburg. Now, so the way that in the modern realm of modern warfare has come around is they've come into something called multi-domain operations, and this is something that modern militaries have come about, and it was basically being able to look at fighting wars at the typical operations of air, land, and sea, something that's been occurring since World War II to a certain extent, got better after World War II. And then you got Joint Service Commands in the United States. China's adopted some, NATO's adopted some. So that's where you can see like the Central Command is a combination of one commander leading all assets assigned to it. So it could be Air Force, Navy, Army, Marine Corps, all that. So some type of so it's some type of multi-service operation or command structure. Multi-domain operations takes that and carries it another step further. It includes cyber warfare. It includes surveillance, space surveillance, and potentially operations in space or to prevent militarization of space. Things like missile defense as well. So multi-domain operations has kind of taken that joint command idea to a further area. So it basically coordinates military activities under some form of formal command structure of all military activities across land, sea, air, space, and cyberspace. And I'm looking at my notes here, coordinating military activities with non-military activities and using technology to achieve the outcomes in the right time and space. So that's a very generic description coming from the United States. Basically, China and NATO have adopted some very similar type functionality. And so one thing that stands out, I'm not going to go into MDO operations, but it's if hybrid warfare, parts of hybrid warfare is a law enforcement function, such as sabotage, which is part of hybrid warfare, which has been, again, traditionally a law enforcement function, how is NATO being involved? So they argue through multi-domain operations that they have some form of jurisdiction coordinating military activities with non-military activities. So they are taking their military assets in an activity and helping support non-military activities. So again, a law enforcement function, a non-military activity. Now, the fact is that this is not an active military operation. You could say it's an active deterrence operation, but NATO again is acting in an area that is traditionally law enforcement. And they are doing the argument is through MDO operations, so multi-domain operations. So they are arguing that they have jurisdiction in this area just through the fact that the modern militaries use multi-domain operations. So, and you can see when you look at how hybrid warfare is all of the areas that it covers, again, some are military, some are not military. Some of them follow very much like the traditional Mao Zedong's gray zone tactics. It all kind of adopts into this basically level just below warfare. And so where a military response is never justified in a gray zone activity, a hybrid warfare activity, the NATO or the modern military structures using multi-domain operations are pushing military into a law enforcement type function. Now there's several issues with that. Is first off, I'll go in there and say is basically it's a militarization of law enforcement, and you see this throughout in the West and even in the United States is where some type of function comes up and saying, well, send the military in. And not everything has a military function. The military is well trained. They're a disciplined force. They can bring, if you don't even talk about military force like firepower to bear, they can bring a lot of coordinated activities because the way they are created, and the fact again the way militaries are structured, they can be effective in those types of operations. But that knee-jerk reaction of bring in the military, bring in the military, bring in the military. It's like not everything has a military function, or it's not meant for military function. So I will go in there and I will sit there and state, first off, is in the modern military sense, and I speak from the American perspective, is rules of engagement. The rules of engagement, especially when you compare it to what it used to be in, let's say, World War One, World War Two. I go back to World War One because, for the most part, the technology has changed, but the function of the nation state has largely been the same. It basically acts the same as it has going all the way back to even pre-World War One. But World War Two is the militaries did military functions. Yes, you had. In the U.S., you had, it was actually George Patton, General Patton, leading the cross-Mexico border raids to capture Pancho Villa after he killed a number of people I think it was in a New Mexico village. So there has been areas where the military is sent in to do what may be considered a law enforcement function. In that case, you could sit there and say an international border, a raiding party came across, the Mexican government wasn't doing anything, so it became a military operation. So there is cases in there, but for the most part, the rules of engagement have been very narrow because militaries did military stuff. They went in there. If they couldn't deter something from happening, they basically resorted to, you start shooting. And there was no rules of engagement. But as modern warfare, as we've crossed past World War II and past the Korean War, there started becoming more of a political aspect of military operations. Now, you could say in Korea there was also a military aspect of the operation because you could go back into the MacArthur and Truman spat between the power of the civilian government over the military in the United States. So that's where you really, and then even George Patton argued that rightfully, especially closer as the war got closer to ending, is generals had to become more and more political. And as things become more and more political, and the fact is that militaries were brought in to not only do a military function, but to serve a political purpose. Now, you go back to a Clausewitzian type views where military action, warfare, is basically foreign policy, politics by another means. And that is true. But the militaries have always been created to fill a certain purpose. All military forces, all branches in the military serve a certain specific purpose. And that's basically to defend the nation state, however it is, or the interests of the nation state. But when you start injecting politics into it, all of a sudden the rules become more and more complicated. And as you start creating more and more rules into your military organizations, you have a concern that you're not going to be able to, what's the best way to say it, is it's going to be harder for them to do their basic function because they will be added more and more variables in any decision they make. So when does a law enforcement function go over to a military function, and when do those rules of engagement change? Is it when you get shot at, or if guns get pointed to you? What point does the rules of engagement change? And then what's the tactics for a law enforcement type function versus a military function? So you're adding more and more, and this is not only down to the enlisted person, this is also when you start to look at your junior officers and maybe your mid-level officers and your mid-level NCOs who are on the scenes, and they have to make a decision to decide what is the rules of engagement for a military outfit. And when you're being specifically trained to be a lethal force, you need to train in that lethal force. Your training to respond to all the different variables that come up in warfare. You can't teach everything of all the variables, but you teach a certain mindset, certain basic, call it your basic level training, and then you go through the process of how you react, and that's through the tactics and all that. But the mindset is the fact is you're there to do something to the enemy. In a law enforcement type function, what is the enemy? So now you're adding in this different element that they have to train for. And as you do that, you're diluting the training. And remember, in most countries, even in professional militaries that you see in the West that have generally longer periods of enlistment, and then officers often serve longer, so that you have more career officers. But there is a large core, I think, in the military. In the U.S., it's roughly 25% of your force rotates out every year. You would mean you only have a limited time to train these people. So if you're adding into this, the fact that you're adding into law enforcement tactics into your training, you're basically diluting the effectiveness of the military. So you spend a lifetime training somebody to be good field commanders, but if you're spending a large portion of your time not doing training to get to become a good commander and to achieve a military objective, but you spend a lot of your time creating times for law enforcement functions, and then again you're adding in all these additional considerations in a law enforcement operation, is you're diluting your military training. And also, you're diluting your law enforcement training. You cannot have a military unit to be really good at law enforcement and really good at military stuff and turning your force over 25% a year. It's just not feasible that you can expect something good to happen. So what's going to happen is you're going to have cases where either people question, the service member question what the right reaction to whatever's being sent to them. So let's say there's somebody on one of these ships sees something going on, and they accidentally, let's say they fire a small arms caliber, like say equivalent of a 20 millimeter or 50 caliber gun at a civilian personnel because they thought somebody was pointing a gun at them, but they're serving in a law enforcement function. Will they be punished as part of law enforcement? Because their military tactics say somebody points a gun at you, you engage the target. That would be a legitimate, in the case of, let's say, military reaction, that would be legitimate. But in a law enforcement, it might be questionable. So that soldier, that leader might decide, okay, it's better to err by not making a decision and wait to see what happens. And what if that leads to another person to being killed? And then what if you build that into your training? You go in there and sit there and say, okay, yep, you got to build in, you've got to hold your fire. Is even like, how do you go in your split second decision? Am I in law enforcement mode for hybrid warfare according to the MDO doctrine, or am I in military mode? And so all of a sudden you've created this pause where you have to stop and think, am I doing this in the rules of engagement? What are my rules of engagement? And again, hybrid warfare runs right up to that line between law enforcement and military action. And when Mao Zedong created the gray zone tactic, that was part of it, was he injected, for example, he injected protests, something to cause pressure on police or military organizations for them to overreact. And then that could justify the use of military force. So purposely putting up civilian assets to push right up to that line between war and law and non-war, called law, just before open warfare. And so you can do that with hybrid warfare. You're pushing right up to that level of what is warfare and not. And you're leaving service people to make that decision. And so you're just adding more and more rules of engagement because you're adding more and more variables, which means more and more variables you have to train. And these, sometimes they do cross. But I can also sit there and say I've served in both the military and law enforcement, not long in either. When you look at the grand scheme of how old I am, is just because you're good at military doesn't mean that your training translates over to law enforcement and vice versa. So it's not really a good sense of training. So it's like, it's the wrong concept is to sit there and dedicate NATO assets, military assets, using the hybrid warfare fitting into MDO operations, using those types of functions is the incorrect use of military assets. And one of the things I stated in this paper, I know I'm running long on this one, so I'll try to cut it short on this one. I know I carried more on about training, but it's a big part of why when you make a mistake of trying to use military assets to conduct law enforcement operations, when you need your militaries to be professional and trained to do the one thing they're supposed to do, adding in more variables in their training and adding more rules of engagement is just a call it a recipe for disaster. Look at what happened in Afghanistan during the Afghanistan pullout when the 13 soldiers were killed. Most of them were Marines. Actually, I think like 10 of the 13 were Marines, 1 was Navy, and 2 were Army. I think that was the count note. So I don't want to sit there and say military. The Marine Corps, for the most part, took the brunt of that attack. You look back at the rules of engagement, and then the subsequent counterattack or counter operation that ended up killing Afghanistan civilians. So by holding off of complicated rules of engagement, you put service members in danger. And then when you start having military conduct operations to go after the enemy, or the person who broke the law, because again, it was a military operation in the aspect that you were using military assets and military to provide security, but it wasn't truly a military operation. And so you're using your military as to serve because it's probably the best one for it, but it wasn't really what they were trained to do. And then they have to react to try to prevent further attacks, and they ended up who they thought was responsible for these attacks or coordinating these attacks, they ended up attacking and ended up killing Afghanistan civilians. So it's just a mix for disaster when you start crossing it. So my overall suggestion is that the West should seek soft power solutions to hybrid warfare. Yes, you can have the military ready to go, but military ready to go to do military stuff. I was going to say the other S word. And you could have them as ready to back up because, again, hybrid warfare, gray zone warfare pushes right up to that line of a crossing into a military action. But again, it bumps right into that line, and it creates as the thing says, it creates this gray zone of what is military. When does it push into being no longer a law enforcement activity and into a military activity? Hybrid warfare and the act of trying to push into the gray zone of trying to push that hybrid attack closer and closer to that edge of active warfare. So yes, it is legitimate. You could have your military as backup behind the scenes, but not playing any sort of active role in it. My suggestion is that they seek a soft power solution to hybrid warfare. Increase law enforcement functions. However you create in the sea, whether on the international waterways or in the coastal waters. How do you assert jurisdiction? The U.S. asserts Coast Guard. China would be an example of another one that uses Coast Guard. Philippines, Japan, they all use Coast Guards. I imagine it's probably the same in many of these Baltic countries, is use that soft power as the solution to these hybrid warfare attacks. And this is what they do. This is their specialty. Oftentimes it's Coast Guard and law enforcement and customs and border protections, is to serve that law enforcement function. And they will bring a law enforcement reaction to a situation. And I also go into soft power. That's the power of the State Department, in the U.S., the Treasury Department. So soft power solutions could be using, again, increasing law enforcement into the area, injecting more enforcement, creating you could create sanctions. You could, again, in combination with the Treasury in the United States, I'm sure the European Union has something very similar. because obviously they are using something similar because they're sanctioning Russia for the war in Ukraine. So obviously they have the same setup. So you use law enforcement. That law enforcement is your deterrent. Just like I think even Secretary Ruta said that they're serving, or no, I'm sorry, it was the Commodore, the Dutch Commodore in charge of the one of the surface fleets outside, operating near the Gulf of Finland. He says basically they're a beat cop serving. It's like, yeah, that's probably the best to describe what you should be doing, but it's not supposed to be conducted by a military organization. I get it. They have a doctrine of multi-domain operations that allows them to do this. I just don't think it's the best solution. I think you should let the law enforcement and your soft power, your diplomats, do what they do best. If that means using sanctions and other activities of the Treasury Department through sanctions, you use that. You use law enforcement functions. So if they feel like MDO and hybrid warfare are tied in together, maybe that they look at some type of doctrine as beefing up your law enforcement activities to counteract hybrid warfare. And in the case of what's going on in the Baltic, is you beef up your Coast Guard, you beef up your Custom and Border protections, your like countries like Sweden, Finland, Poland, Latvia, Estonia, these countries that have been affected most by these operations by the Russians, is increase the assets of your law enforcement and soft power assets that are used to assign this. And don't go to that knee-jerk reaction that every problem has a military solution to it. It doesn't, sir. It dilutes the effectiveness of your military. It dilutes, it can cause an incident where they cross into is not knowing when they're operating in a military sphere or a law enforcement sphere. When you send law enforcement to do law enforcement things, that's the outcome you get. They are trained to do that. Their reactions will be based on that. So I think it's let the military do military stuff. Let the law enforcement do the law enforcement stuff. And if you think you need more, you increase the what you're spending on those type of operations, and you're probably going to have a better outcome. All right, so that's my spiel. I ran a long time on that one. Sorry about that one. I know I went off the rails on that one, but I think it's important to know is that it basically is you can justify a military reaction through MDO, but it's not the right action. It's just not there's not a military solution to every problem. And so, going on, NASA sets criteria for the next space station. So this is hard to believe because I actually went and saw parts of the International Space Station being made in Huntsville, Alabama. It was in a clean room, but you could see in there and see them making it. I don't remember what module it was. And it was one of the early modules, so I think it was. I don't know. I'm not going to speculate because I have a pretty good chance I'll be wrong. But I'll just say I saw one of the modules being made. It was actually just a big. There wasn't a lot to it. It's basically the. It looked like aluminum backbone of it. So anyway, the International Space Station began its service in November 20th, 1998, with the launch of the Russian Zyra control module on top of a Russian proton rocket. And then about 2.5 weeks later, Space Shuttle Endeavour launched from Cape Canaveral on STS-88 and delivered the Unity Node 1 module together in 1998. And then the first crew took off from Russia, carrying 2 Russian cosmonauts and an American astronaut on November 2nd, 2000. And since that date, the International Space Station has been continuously manned. So it's in its 25th year, but it has, like all things, it's got a set forced retirement for 2030. It's getting old. It's starting to have problems. I think they have a consistent leak problem. They haven't been able to figure it out. They're having to do constant maintenance on it. There's 2. I've written about this several times. I've made a quick note about this. Is two of the astronauts that are up there are the Boeing astronauts that have been stranded. We're supposed to be there for 8 days, and it looks like they'll be up there for 8 months before they get home. They actually performed a spacewalk up there. So it was kind of amazing because most of the time, NASA, when they prepare, like they start having astronauts do spacewalks, many of them are unplanned, but when you go up there to do something specific, you train in the simulator in, I want to say it's in Huntsville. I don't think it's in Houston. I think it's in Huntsville, but it could be in Houston. Well, anyway, you get that big water tank where they test, they do spacewalks as close as they can get to some type of weightless or microgravity type environment. And so these two astronauts, Sunita Williams and Butch Wilmore, did not train for this mission. They didn't train for a spacewalk because they're only supposed to be there for 8 days and they're supposed to test the Boeing Starliner. Well, anyway, they're stranded, so NASA put them up to send them out on a spacewalk. It was Butch Wilmore's fifth, and he's actually the commander of the Starliner mission, which is now defunct. So he's just an astronaut. And the current commander of the space station is stranded astronaut Sunita Williams. So she is actually the current commander of the space station. Again, completely unplanned. Tells you some of the flexibility and good training. It's funny when you talk about good training, you focus on doing one thing like hybrid warfare, you have better outcomes. So here's two that were trained as astronauts, and they were able to take all those skills and be able to flex it into a much more flexible mission, which actually is probably a good thing for NASA to kind of understand how in a long duration mission where they have flexible enough training where people can step up and do roles. But anyway, it was Butch Wilmore's fifth spacewalk, and he hadn't walked in space for like 10 years, something like that, maybe even a little longer. Sunita Williams, she just broke the woman's record. She did 2 spacewalks in the month of January and broke the female record for the most spacewalks for a female, which I think it was her 9th spacewalk in something like 60 hours of spacewalking. So again, completely unplanned, but they're having to do activities that the space station is getting old. It requires constant maintenance, and not necessarily saying what Williams and Wilmore did was emergency maintenance, but the fact is there's more maintenance that has to go on with the space station. It is getting old. And again, in the one of the Russian modules, there's actually a leak. They can't find how to fix it. The systems, the redundancy systems in the space station can compensate for it, but the fact is there's a leak and it's a concern. The station is getting old. It's been bombarded since 1998, at least one of the modules or 2 of the modules, since 1998 with being up there with cosmic rays, taking a lot more the harshness of space through radiation. It's just eventually just wearing on course. It's getting old. Time to replace it. Now, the ISS is basically it's a NASA-run organization, a NASA program. It was created in conjunction with Roscosmos with the help of the Canadian Space Industry, the ESA, and JAXA, the Japanese Space Administration. So they're all combined, but for the most part, operations are run out of on the non-Russian side, called the NASA side, where ESA, JAXA, and all that is run out of Houston, mission control in Houston, and of course the Russian side is run by Roscosmos. I know they launch out of Kazakhstan for the most part. I'm not sure where their mission control is. I assume Moscow, but I'm not 100% sure. So again, the operations are run out of 2 mission controls because these are government operations. Well, NASA, just like with the commercial space program or commercial crew program and the commercial resupply program, NASA got out of the issue. They're not creating rockets in themselves. Like in the old days when they had the Titan II and the Atlas and the Redstone, and later Saturn V, which wasn't really meant for low Earth orbit, Saturn 1B, which was used for low Earth orbit. Those were NASA-developed rockets for NASA-specific requirements. NASA has gotten out of that. They basically tell SpaceX and Northrop Grumman and trying to remember the other organization that SpaceX, Northrop Grumman, which Northrop Grumman does the Cygnus program. And I think there's one more, but I can't remember the organization. And then, of course, you had the manned programs, which was supposed to be the Starliner, which only has been up there twice, manned once, but has not had a successful mission. By the fact, you got 2 stranded astronauts up there. And then you have the SpaceX with Crew Dragon. So basically, NASA has gotten out. NASA basically just leases seats on a Crew Dragon, Starliner, but also the Russian program. In fact, the last SpaceX mission actually had where the Russians leased a seat on a SpaceX Crew Dragon. So basically what has happened is that the Russian side, of course, Russia is still using their government rockets and their government launch facilities and to launch resupply missions and to send their crew people up there through on their Soyuz rocket and Progress resupply missions. NASA now does it. They've basically gotten out of that. They just lease. They buy. They purchase the resupply missions. They pay for the resupply mission. Once the supplies being sent up, but they don't have any activities going into that. That's all done through the private organization, SpaceX, Northrop Grumman, Boeing for a little part of it. And so that same type of mentality for that commercial program is NASA is basically getting out of the low Earth orbit game. They are not going to create a next new space station. They will look at setting a criteria for space stations, and they will, like with these missions, they will just lease space on those space stations, on those commercial space stations. So they set the criteria of what they wanted to what they would like to see in a space station. Because I wrote about this several months ago about all these different options of commercial space stations. And some of them NASA is interested in, some of them NASA is not interested in. So they basically set the criteria of what they wanted in a commercial space station that they would be willing to rent. Now, why this is important is because going to space is expensive. It's not as expensive as it used to be, but it's still expensive. So for a private company to put interest and resources into launching a space station, they want to make sure that there is some guaranteed contract of some they be able to afford it. So when NASA speaks, that's saying they will lease space, and what NASA wants the criteria is, those private companies are going to listen to NASA because they want that government contract to guarantee that their investment to get a space station, to develop, get a space station up there, they want to guarantee for this time period that they have some type of guaranteed contract that's going to do it. So basically, even though NASA's not going to say they're going to build a space station, and they're not telling somebody or any company how to build a space station, they're just saying what their criteria is that could lead to a government contract. And again, whoever pays the piper whistles the tune. So NASA's kind of playing that point at this point in the space race. So NASA's aim is that they've looked at it as they've maintained 25 years of continuous manned service in space. This is something that they want to continue. They want to maintain a continuous presence in low Earth orbit to provide NASA with the experience again, there's a lot of experimentation, but when NASA's looking at operations, it's easier to do things in low Earth orbit that we have a lot of experience at than you're looking at more of the long duration missions. Going to the moon, going to Mars is, when you're looking at those types of programs, you're looking at much more extended long duration space flight. And the best place and cheapest place, cheap is relative in this term, is to do all these operations is to do them in low Earth orbit. You can give your astronauts a lot of experience in long duration space flight in low Earth orbit. So they want to keep a space station because they are looking at actual government programs of going to Mars and going to the moon, that NASA would take a lead in using something like SLS, the extraordinarily outrageously expensive rocket system that NASA has created. But that's a NASA rocket. And so they would use government resources for operations like that, but not in low Earth orbit. They're basically saying, from the NASA perspective, now there's going to be other government, or like China will have their own space station, most likely Russia will have their own space station. But basically, so Roscosmos, whatever the Chinese space organization is called, whatever their designation is, they will have their government. NASA government space station. NASA will not have a government space station. They will be leasing space, but they want to sit there and say that they want to have an ability. So they want to be able to do long duration space flight. They want to be able to have a continuous man presence in space. So oftentimes these crews that go up there right now to the space station stay 6 to 9 months, and they do some long duration ones that push close to a year. NASA wants to continue that. They want to maintain that. So that means that any space station that's created has to have the ability to get resupply missions to keep those astronauts up there. You don't want a space station that sends up there that only has 2 months of supply or 2 weeks of supply, and you have to come back down, or that takes every 6 months this private company is able to get resupply up there. So it has to be a space station that is set up for long duration and can use the current infrastructure that is used to get to resupply the International Space Station. So you're probably looking at something needing to have a common docking ring that, for example, Starliner, because Starliner could come back in this program. I mean, Starliner is not a disaster from the perspective of, it's got a lot of teething problems, so it is a disaster from one area. But it's other companies are either Boeing's going to look at continuing it, or other companies are looking at buying Starliner and basically finishing the project. So Starliner, but you're looking at common docking. What does the Cygnus spacecraft use? The common docking ring. And so, and also having to be able, because you have a common docking ring, that means you can use SpaceX, Starliner, Cygnus, and at a later point, Dream Chaser from Sierra Space. So you're going to have these options to be able to send resupply missions using common docking facilities, and also because you have SpaceX running the Falcon 9, and I'm not sure what Northrop Grumman uses for their rocket. It's just slipping my mind. You want to be able to have that common infrastructure because you want to have continuous presence. They don't want to send these astronauts back and forth every 2 weeks. They're talking about long duration space flight. They want to be able to, again, maintain and grow their skills at long duration space flight and to learn low Earth orbit operations, because it could be a case where they have to be able to call it assembling ships in orbit, whether in Earth orbit or in lunar orbit. So you can practice all those operations, getting experience to be able to do those types of operations in low Earth orbit. So these are things what NASA wants to be able to do. And they have to be able to have that experience of having their astronauts up there doing spacewalking on a regular basis, living up there for long periods of time, the exercise programs, and also just learn to continue to grow the science of operating in long duration. And NASA's had a constant presence for 25 years. They want to keep that going. And so the current director of ISS, Robin Gattens, stated that low Earth orbit will be the hub for scientific discovery, technological advancement, and international cooperation. A lot of buzz terms there, but she is not necessarily wrong in that aspect, because you look at what often, I more so Blue Origin is where SpaceX wants to move out of basically create The more, of course, their interest is Mars, but they're looking at making the human species a multiplanetary species. Blue Origin wants to create um, applications in low Earth orbit that benefit people on Earth. So a different aspect of what they're going. So it is talk about the scientific discovery and international cooperation. Those are things they're wanting to do. So the technological advancement is there is a lot of experimentation goes in space. As um, NASA gets out of the game of running the International Space Station, there are still going to be experiments they will want to run. And so they also want to have the ability of a space station to be able to support these scientific discoveries and these technological advancements. Now, so NASA will continue to do that. Now, what will change is as the cost of space flight or going into low Earth orbit comes down and the space number of space stations become maybe more and more space stations become available, is where NASA is very much has a yes, scientific discovery, technological advancement is a big part of their programs, but they are limited to what the government funds them. What does Congress fund NASA? And that's their limited scope of operations. But once you start dropping the price and you start establishing these ongoing operations in low Earth orbit, you're going to find more of these private companies are going to expand what they're looking for in space, where maybe NASA's going to look at the very narrow criteria for what's needed to go to the moon, and maybe somebody like Blue Origin is going to look at how can they create better carbon nanofibers in low Earth orbit that they can't do on Earth. So that's the kind of the direction is that, yes, NASA wants the next space station to be able to support technological advancement and scientific discovery, but that is also going to lead to a wider field of vision as these commercial companies start expanding out in space. And the big key factor for them to do it is you need to lower the cost to orbit. And that's where you're going to see something like New Glenn, and I think even more so if they can, and I'm sure they'll get it to work because it's amazing what they've done so far, SpaceX with the Starship and Super Heavy. The reason why I leave New Glenn in there is because New Glenn has a much more common fairing structure to be able to carry the current configuration of how NASA thinks about launching things into low Earth orbit or probes out into out in space. Falcon 9, Falcon Heavy, New Glenn use that very common fairing structure size. Starship Super Heavy doesn't. It's got a completely different way of doing it. They have to SpaceX still has to work on cargo manufacture, like how they could deliver more cargo outside of the Starlink 2 satellites. So those are things that are going, but the thing is that will be able to lower the cost of going to orbit. In fact, one space station that's being promoted can be launched in a single Starship launch. And that way you don't actually have to have a fairing. It's just they configure it to be put on top of the Super Heavy booster, and you just send it up. So that in one single launch, it took hundreds of launches to put the International Space Station. This one that's talking about going up into a single launch is obviously would be smaller than the International Space Station. But I think when they look at what the Super Heavy booster can lift theoretically in the low Earth orbit and the weight of the space station, I think it would take 3 launches and not even at maximum capacity to build something the size and weight of the International Space Station. That's how much that costs. That cost of going to orbit has to drop to be able to create that scope, that wide scope where you're going to see much more than what's limited to what NASA's contracts are going to do. And I think that's what, I can't say for sure. I don't get to talk to Robin Gattens. I don't have an interview with her, but it seems like that's where the NASA's point of view is. They understand is they have certain needs. They want to be able to promote scientific discovery, technological advancement. They want to use the infrastructure that they can keep long duration or astronauts in space continuously for long durations. So they want all that infrastructure being available, but then also have, again, these technological advancements. But these are things that are going to be able to take off with the private industries as the cost of orbits goes down. It's going to open up the aperture of what is possible, what is the discoveries outside of space tourism. There is obviously going to be a space tourism aspect, but that is also relying on lowering the cost of launches. Blue Origin, for example, is not interested in space tourism, even though they run a space tourism business with New Shepard rocket in their suborbital launches. When they get into space using the New Glenn, they are not looking at trying to create. They're not trying to create a space tourism business. They're looking at it from the aspect of just trying to manufacture, and that's when you look at Blue Ring and stuff like that as well. So that's the biggest thing, I think. And I also think that if that really takes off, so in the short term, a government contract is needed. Those private companies need that guarantee of a government contract. And so what NASA says is critically important. But once you move past the midterm, it's going to start moving away. And again, it's reliant on getting the cost to orbit down. And then you're going to see that aperture open up, where there's going to be more and more opportunities. And in the end, if it works out, call me an optimist, but I look at the economics of New Glenn, and more so with with Super Heavy from SpaceX, is when you look at the cost of orbit, the economics of space really changes, and it opens up a lot of opportunities. And as those opportunities increase, you're going to see that NASA is going to be a minor player in low Earth orbit as far as from the American side. And I would say also from the ESA side, the Canadians, and JAXA, because all of them are reliant right now on NASA. And I think NASA will really become the smaller player. And so from call it the Western perspective, is private industry will outgrow what NASA's contribution to space will be. And once they get to the point is where they can start making money in low Earth orbit, meaning the commercial companies, and they start expanding out, you could see that the commercial interest will probably expand beyond NASA's capability to move outside of low Earth orbit. So I think there's a lot of possibilities, and I think NASA is taking the right approach. Is they are creating the seed money. They do have their specific requirements that they want to meet for their long missions, long duration goals in space. And so I think they have legitimate things. So it's not like NASA is talking about quitting, but I think they're looking at the perspective is that they are going to eventually become a minor player in low Earth orbit. And they will just lease the space they'll go, and then the power of the marketplace, because there's a lot of potential money to be made up in low Earth orbit. And I'm not talking about space tourism. I think that's going to be a small part of it. The economics of spaceflight has to drop a lot more if you're going to have a real space tourism business. But I really think when you look at what SpaceX and Blue Origin are looking at, and there's going to be other companies that are going to think about the same thing, but they might use Blue Origin and SpaceX assets to get themselves up in space, where SpaceX and Blue Origin can kind of do their end-to-end approach. There's going to be other companies that will lease their launch assets to do things in space, for example, like Bigelow Space or something like that. So I think it's just a matter of if NASA has seen. NASA seems I think NASA has been impressed by what its commercial space program has done, which is it's not what NASA did, it's what NASA guidance. NASA planted the seed money. And if that seed money wasn't there, you probably would not have seen Starliner, which I know has been disappointing, but you would not have seen Crew Dragon. You would not have seen the Cygnus spacecraft. So I think they're looking at the point of view is that NASA could plant the seed money and set the criteria of what they want to do to justify their seed money, and that's going to lead to something greater. Because it would be hard to see that SpaceX, without having some of those government contracts, would they have been able to launch their Starlink constellation with their own funding. It's hard to believe they needed some type of seed money to develop the Falcon 9, which has been just wildly successful. All right, so again, I'm running long on that one. But I'm get really nerdy about space. I think it's an amazing opportunity. I just hope I think NASA is very happy, and this has crossed multiple administrations. I think NASA has been happy with what it's been able to do with its commercial programs, and I think they believe this could be replicated in low Earth orbit for space stations, and I believe that is going to be the case. They set the initial guidelines, they provide the seed money, and eventually let something be created that goes way beyond their expectations. My only concern is NASA, in the U.S., NASA and the FAA need to make sure they stay out of the way. NASA, I don't think is going to be a problem. NASA likes to go to space, but NASA is also risk averse. Especially after Columbia, but Challenger, of course, Apollo 1. NASA is a very, I don't want to say even Apollo 1 because they still went to the moon. NASA is a very risk averse organization. So if something goes wrong, you could see them pulling the brakes. Or stepping on the brakes. I say pulling brakes, I always think of a train. No, pulling the brakes on a train. So FAA, I'm less optimistic about their role in things. All right, so we're going to talk about it's time for the U.S. to reconsider the supercarrier. So, sorry, I had to get a drink. I got some misunderstanding on this one, I think. I'm not arguing against the aircraft carrier. I have some reservations about it, the cost, and I also think about the drones. I think about what's happened in the Ukraine war and the use of unmanned drones and the possibility of mass amounts of kamikaze drones coming over an aircraft carrier. And these drones cost several $1 million total, against a $13 billion aircraft with another $5 billion worth of aircraft on it. That's probably even an understatement. And just being able to destroy the aircraft carrier. So, that's some of my reservations of it. But I'm not calling for the end of the aircraft carrier. I'm just thinking that as a country and as the West, we need to consider are these things worth it? Are these things set for, is the future going to change to such an extent that running a large 100,000 feet, call it 320 meter long aircraft carrier, 330 yard long aircraft carrier, does it really make sense? It's something this big in the water that could possibly that costs billions of dollars to maintain or to create, billions of dollars to run. Is these going to be viable in the future? So I'm not calling for the end of the aircraft carrier. I'm just calling is it time to start thinking about a future of not putting all your eggs in the aircraft carrier basket? Now, I go in there is the age of the battleship ended when the Kido sunk all these battleships at the in Pearl Harbor, and the also I can't remember where it happened. I think it's near Singapore, where a Royal Navy task force was sunk. It was made up of a battleship and a heavy cruiser, or it might have been two battleships, were sunk quickly by aircraft. The age of the battleship ended when when after, we'll just stick to Pearl Harbor. We'll say the age of the battleship ended, and you can actually even go to the Bismarck. The Bismarck was damaged by some cheap biplane torpedo bombers that damaged the Bismarck enough that the Royal Navy was able to catch up with its battleships and sink it. And then you look at what the raids on Italian Navy by British aircraft carriers. But the U.S. Navy really had to reconsider the aircraft or the battleship when most of them were sitting in at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. Now, I'll go back. All the Pearl Harbor battleships, are, except for the Arizona, the Oklahoma, and the training ship Utah, all came back into service later in the war. So as big of a blow it seems, is most of those battleships actually came back. Only 3 battleships were actually lost permanently at Pearl Harbor. But it forced the U.S. to change, where they could no longer rely on the guns of the battleship, and they had to go back to relying on their aircraft carriers, which they didn't have that many of them. They had a lot more battleships than they had aircraft carriers at the time Pearl Harbor occurred. But it became the age of the aircraft carrier was brought upon by the forced end of the battleship, and never looked back. And the aircraft carrier has grown as aircraft carriers have become bigger and heavier. The aircraft carrier itself had to become bigger and heavier. And so eventually got into the age of the supercarrier. And is that age of the supercarrier going to be like, is it going to happen at some point as well? And the risk is immense when you think about it, is that these aircraft carriers that they're building, which they built one of, the USS Gerald R. Ford, they've built one. I think another one, the John F. Kennedy, will be available later this year, but then it still has to go through sea trials, but it should be commissioned later this year. These take a long time to build. These are taking the better part of a decade to build each. And it's obviously going to speed up. The Newport News building facilities have basically doubled their ability as great aircraft carriers, but these things are not built quickly. They're not built cheaply. And so at what point are these things going to be, are these aircraft, these big aircraft carriers, are these going to be the way of the future? Or are they going to be so vulnerable? Because again, you go in there, you talk about, you could be placing between crew, value of the aircraft carrier, and you're talking about the aircraft on it. So you're talking, let's just kind of round it off that you're saying $20 billion of U.S. investment in one location, an aircraft carrier. And if that aircraft carrier sunk, because China is putting a lot of money into missiles that can sink an aircraft carrier, or so they can claim can sink an aircraft carrier, just through the size of the warhead and the ballistic speed of it making contact with something even 100,000 tons. And it's a lot cheaper to build a missile and a lot quicker to build a missile than it is to build an aircraft carrier. And if just you fire 100 missiles and just one of these giant aircraft carrier missiles hit an aircraft carrier, could it sink the aircraft carrier? Maybe not, but it will take it out of service. And in a war, when you're talking about more of as a come as you are war, because you're not going to build an aircraft carrier in the duration of a war that you have with China, it's a come as you are war. And if your naval superiority is tied up into just 11 aircraft carriers, is that a smart use that could be attacked by drones, could be attacked by these missiles? the USS Harry S. Truman was operating, I wrote about this, was operating against the Houthis near the Red Sea. I think they're in the Arabian Sea, actually. And it almost got struck by a Houthi missile. And the Chinese are going to put up a lot more sophisticated, heavier, and more of them missiles against any approach of a U.S. aircraft carrier. So is it time to start reconsidering this? And so while I'm talking about reconsidering this is that I don't know if it's time to end the aircraft carrier, and I'll go back into the start of it. The aircraft carrier has been a symbol of military power, of power projection. It serves both as a military ability, where you can basically put an airfield right off the coast of wherever, where a crisis point is, but it also signals what's important to the U.S. So if there's something going on, let's say I don't know, I guess an example would be recently was the Hezbollah acting against Israel. The U.S. Navy sent an aircraft carrier to the Eastern Mediterranean and basically signaled, and it didn't participate in military activity. It basically sent a diplomatic signal to Iran and to Hezbollah is we're here. And it didn't fire a shot, but it was just the fact that it was there. It is a projection of power, but it's also a projection of what the national interest is of the United States. The French and the British also have aircraft carriers, which could be considered super carriers. The Chinese do as well. Chinese are still in the infancy of developing all the procedures needed to support aircraft carriers at sea. So they're kind of like in the, I don't want to say in the infancy of their program, but they're very early on in their program. They still have some issues that they need to work through. But basically, aircraft carriers are a signal to what your national intent is. So when you go through these so they serve more than just a military interest. So the age of the aircraft from that period, because it does serve into, again, going into the idea of soft power, it serves that ability. And that giant aircraft carrier really signals when the U.S. sends, for example, I'm going to stick with the U.S., sends an aircraft carrier, it is sending a sizable amount of its military power into a location and sending a message by doing so. And that's what the super carrier gives you. And so the current Nimitz class aircraft carriers, there's 11 aircraft carriers in the United States, super carriers, and 10 of them are Nimitz class aircraft carriers, and one of them is the USS Gerald R. Ford, which is replacing the Nimitz class carriers. The Nimitz class carriers have a lifespan of 50 years, so they're coming up on their 50 years throughout the next, I think all the way through 2035, I think is where it goes through. Maybe a little bit longer than that, maybe 2040 before the last Nimitz class gets retired. But the USS Nimitz is coming close to its retirement. And so I believe that John F. Kennedy is supposed to replace the Nimitz. Actually, I think if you look at it, the Gerald Ford is supposed to replace the Nimitz. The U.S. is statutorily required by acts of Congress to maintain 11 nuclear aircraft carriers. They can go down as low as 10. They can go as high as 12, but they have to maintain an 11 number of aircraft carriers. And they're statutorily required to do that. And that means in the Navy budget, the Navy has to put in their budget that when they put their proposals forward for a budget, it has to support 11 nuclear aircraft carriers. And then now it's got to work in its budget to build new ones. And that's the Gerald R. Ford, which again are costing in excess of $13 billion apiece. And so the cost is growing in these particular carriers because they're running into supply issues. They're also having a lot of teething issues. So the Gerald R. Ford class uses what's called an EMALS, which is basically a magnetic launching system, which is supposed to be able to launch aircraft faster than the traditional steam catapult, and they're having problems with it. The Chinese also have an EMAL system, and they're having problems with it. In fact, it looks like they're having more significant problems than the U.S. is. The U.S. has actually deployed the Gerald R. Ford to already on an extended tour. And I think it actually launched combat operations when it was on its extended tour. So it's actually been deployed. So obviously the catapult system, the EMAL system works in the Gerald Ford, but the EMAL system is supposed to launch and recover aircraft faster than the traditional steam catapult, and it's not. So right now the Ford carrier, in the basic role of an aircraft carrier, which is launching aircraft sorties, it is actually a step down than the current Nimitz class. And they have spent money, done software upgrades, they've done hardware upgrades, and they still have not created a system that is equal to the steam catapults on the Nimitz class. Now, the U.S. has a lot of experience running those steam catapults, and they've been running those steam catapults since, I think, the early version of them came out in the late 40s, I think, might have been the 50s. So they're looking at 70 plus years of running steam catapults, and they've only got a few years of running the EMAL system. There's going to be teething problems. They can eventually fix it, but the fact is they haven't, and they're procuring 6 aircraft carriers, building in the EMAL system in something that is less effective than the current aircraft carriers and cost a lot more. Now, one of the things that drives up cost is, first off, there's only one facility you can make the Gerald R. Ford, which is in Newport News, the Huntington Ingalls shipbuilding in Newport News, Virginia. It has supply chain issues where it's basically supplying 2,000 firms from 46 states provide parts for the aircraft carrier. Some of that is good, some of that is bad, but it feels very much like when critics of Congress, and Congress deserves a lot of criticism, when they say that the Defense Department is a jobs program, when you're sitting there spreading out 2,000 supplying firms in 46 states, you can kind of see where that argument holds true. But it's also easier if you can create ships, and also the aspect of if you can create ships in a modular format, is maybe you don't have to build everything right there in Newport News. You can build it somewhere else and then ship it in and then just be able to put it on the ship. But that's also part of the supply chain issue, is you go in there, is that you have 2,000 supplying firms in 46 states, and there's these constant issues of supply chain. So it's not only supply chain constraints, it's the ability of when delays happen. So for example, when you go in there and put on the propeller, the prop of the aircraft carrier, I'm just doing this as a simple example, is if they deliver the propeller before the propeller shaft is installed, that doesn't do any good. You're delaying making the aircraft carrier because you've delivered the parts in the wrong order. And it's so easy when you've got supply issues and supply constraints, and you've got 2,000 supplying firms in 46 states, you can see where something can fall out of order of when it's supposed to be built. So you've got that issue. And then all of a sudden you got issues of inexperienced shipbuilders, because when COVID-19 started, a lot of production facilities, including defense facilities, they cut back, slowed production. They did things like where maybe you would have a welder every, when you go in there, averages on your floor, on your production area, you had a welder every 3 feet. Because of COVID rules, you had to put one every 10 feet. So you had to slow down what you were doing. You weren't getting stuff from the 2,000 supplying firms. So a lot of shipbuilders just retired. Experienced ones retired and been replaced by inexperienced shipbuilders. And I wrote about that earlier, about some of the challenges of shipbuilding. So you've got these cost overruns. You've got you're building aircraft carriers that still do not have the EMAL system figured out yet. So your lead ship hasn't done this. And then you go into it as the Gerald R. Ford has not been through every certification process. So you don't know, like, for example, they have to do damage control and recovery is one of the major things that still has to be tested. Well, that goes through there, and then they say, oh, yeah, this part's wrong. We need to update that in the next class. You're already starting to build 6 aircraft carriers, and you don't have the final design yet from the lead class. So that means that if something happens and that the Ford class fails in those tests, you're going to have to stop production, or you may have to redo production. You might have to redo the plans. You're going to have to stop production, and that's going to cost more money and cost more dollars. So you're driving up the cost of building a Ford class aircraft carrier, and in an environment where the technology could very well pass it up. So you're spending more and more money on a system that is unproven, that is less capable, and you go through the process of thinking, is this the right technology? You continue to spend more and more and more money. And so and you don't know if the technology is going to be there, because when you look at these killer missiles, these possibilities of drone swarms, things we've seen in the Ukraine war, where a cheap drone can take out a multi-million-dollar tank. I know it's not the same thing, but they've tested the idea is that these using drone swarms and stuff like that is more than enough to overpower the air defense system of a aircraft carrier, or you have them expend, like this is also run in Ukraine, where Ukraine launches ATACMS missiles along with drone swarms. And so the Russian air defense spends munitions shooting down things like cheap drones and not the more important missiles, or you expend all your ammunition trying to fight off drone swarms, and then when the big missiles come, you don't have anything left. So some of these technologies still have to be developed, and of course, it's not just the aircraft carrier itself. You have the ships that come with it in the task force. So you go in there and start thinking: we're spending a lot of money, and the technology of warfare, the offensive technology, which is always ahead of the defensive technology, is advancing to a point that these expensive, we're spending more and more money on these aircraft carriers. Is it really worth it at this point? Is the cost effectiveness or the cost of building these aircraft carriers getting to the point, and again, you still have a system that is not even proven? Is it really worth it? Has technology passed them by? Are we building just modified relics of the past? When I talk about that, is the Ford class carrier is basically an upgraded Nimitz class. It's got it uses less personnel through more automation. It has the EMOL system, which takes less maintenance than the steam catapult system. It has more advanced nuclear reactors that at even at base level, at the worst time, can only produce 25% more power than the Nimitz, but it can produce theoretically up to 300% more than the Nimitz class. So these are basically, but the basic design is basically a Nimitz class aircraft carrier, which is just amazing too, that the cost overruns, that we've perfected the Nimitz class carrier, but when you break off producing for a while and try to create a new class, which is just modified, all the problems they're having. But then again, it's not the nuclear power plants, it's not the seaworthiness necessarily, though they haven't gone through the full damage control testing. There's a lot of open questions to the Ford class carrier. And what if we're at that moment of Pearl Harbor where the age of the battleship is about to pass over to something else, as we're starting to see more and more automated ships, more and more drones, more and more options that don't require these big, massive structures. But as you start doing more and more, like Project 33, using more autonomous ships, is it getting to the point that the aircraft carrier could easily be defeated by something that is cheaper, smaller? Have we crossed into that point, just like the battleship? And the other thing that they go into is like, do we want to spend? Do we really want to buy more than 6 air? Do we want to do 10? Maybe it's a combination, as you still maintain a lower number of Gerald R. Ford classes, but you replace them with more smaller aircraft carriers, like the USS America, which I think is about 60,000 tons, or the Zumu class that the Japanese Navy runs, that weighs like 26,000 tons compared to 110,000 tons or so of the Ford class and the Nimitz class. Carries less aircraft carriers, or carries less aircraft, less munitions, less stores, but they're quicker to build, they're cheaper to build. I think when I looked at the America class, which can carry 30 up to 32, I think, F-35Bs, which are less capable than the F-35C, and maybe in some of the limits of delivering ordnances, less so than the FA-18 Super Hornet. And you can't really put the Super Hornet on the USS America, but you can build, I think if I read the number, you can build 3 US America class. I can't remember the exact class of it. It's not America class, but you can build 3 ships in the America class for the cost of 1 Ford aircraft carrier, and 3 Americas could carry 100 jet fighters. Now, they are F-35Bs, which are the short takeoff and landing versions of the F-35, which is probably considered the less capable version of the F-35. But do you have to be necessarily committed to the idea that if you build smaller aircraft carriers, but more of them, you open up the number of facilities that you can create or that can use to produce the aircraft carrier? You can create at a cheaper rate. You create more of them, they come faster. So you can build 3 Americas for the cost of 1 Gerald R. Ford, and you could do so quicker. You could get those 3 done quicker, cheaper, and you can have all 3 deployed at the same, by the time you get the Gerald R. Ford. And for example, just from pure perspective, I know it's not talking about the magazines and the weapons and the fuel storage and all the other things. And then you got the questions: do you want nuclear powered small carriers, or do you want conventionally powered? Go into all those questions. Obviously the preference would be nuclear powered, but then that's another expense that goes in there because the America is not nuclear powered, which also drives down the cost of building it. But 3 Americas carry just as many aircraft as 1 Gerald R. Ford, and you can do so cheaper and you can build them quicker. Is the option to look at more smaller aircraft carriers instead of putting all your assets into one? The Navy argues no, they don't want that. They want the bigger ones because they look at the sortie rates in the lifetime is that these big super carriers can launch more aircraft cheaper in the long run cost per sortie. The bigger aircraft carriers can do it cheaper so that the cost of maintaining the fleet ends up being cheaper with these bigger aircraft carriers. But in the modern battlefield, you're putting more of your assets into one location. So, for example, if 1 Gerald Ford class carrier is taken out by a Chinese missile, all 100 aircraft are out. But if, let's say, the same attack only takes out 1 America class, I know it's not America class, but I can't remember the class, but say 1 America class, you still have 2/3 of the aircraft available for sorties. So all of a sudden, not all your assets are in one location. Now, one missile will probably not sink a Ford class. 1 missile would probably sink a America class. But again, this is a come as you are war. We're not going to be like World War II where you have time to build 20 Essex class carriers in the time of the war. So it goes into some of those questions. Now, I don't have the answers to this, but it's like there's some of the questions is there is legitimate concern is it time to consider something other than the Ford class or these big super carriers? The other option is, well, why can't you extend the life of the Nimitz class so that you don't have to build so many Fords? Well, you have to go through, first off, you're going into an area where these aircraft carriers are old and they require a lot more maintenance, even if you have to go in there. And then I think a refueling cycle plus a maintenance refit maintenance, call it you would have to basically put in another midlife refit for it. I think it takes 4 years of work to get the refueled and ready to go, basically get the carrier operational for another 15 years. So you'd have to pay for that. And so it doesn't look like that is a really viable alternative. So the alternative is to look, is there other options besides building so many Ford-class carriers? Again, I don't know the answer to that, and I can't really answer it. I'm not an expert, but I've looked at the production rates. I've looked at the statutory guidelines from Congress. I have looked at the life of the Ford class or the Nimitz class carrier. I've looked at the ongoing issues with the Ford class, and it is a legitimate area of question. And then just knowing history, at some point, and it feels like we're getting to that point when you look at what in the Ukraine war and the advancements of automation weapon systems have created and the use of that more and more missiles. It used to be, it was hard for a missile of any size to be able to find a warship, because when you look at even a big ship like a Nimitz class aircraft carrier, it's a speck in the sea. And so it was hard for a missile to hit something like that, which was relatively small, and a ship that can have defensive capability built into it. It was hard to attack, but now we're or hit a carrier in the past. Even when you had the missiles long enough to do it, the technology is advancing where that may no longer be the case. The Air Force the U.S. Air Force just recently tested a way to attack warships using basically an advanced version of a JDAM, which is basically just taking a dumb bomb and hooking an advanced seeker head and fins onto the back of it. So just taking an old dumb bomb and making a smart bomb out of it in a cheap function, they've been able to find a way to attack warships with one of those and hit them. And I think actually it doesn't hit the warship. It actually hits in the water and explodes underneath the warship. So that's just some of the advancements you're seeing with. And so now it's like you're getting more and more into it. Is it really worth, first off, the cost, but is it worth putting all your military basket and reliability or your capability in a Ford class carrier, when it could quite easily have been the point where we've crossed into that Pearl Harbor moment, where the age of the battleship was passed over to the age of the aircraft carrier. The time of the aircraft carrier, the manned aircraft carrier, the super carrier is going to come to an end at some point. Is that point now? I don't know. But then you also go into the issues that you go in there and look at the technology when you talk about missile systems. Is the Marine Corps is creating what's called littoral regiments that will have an area access denial system, and will have a long-range strike capability against ships as well as land targets off of islands in the Pacific. Then you got the Army with their, like for example, their Typhoon missile system. One of them's deployed in the Philippines, where they will be able to strike Chinese targets and ships from Pacific Islands. And you're not going to sink that with a Chinese missile. Those islands are not going to be sunk. And these littoral regiments and these missile batteries are mobile. They can move around. You can diversify them. And so, again, it feels like what the role of the aircraft carrier in the Western Pacific is being passed by. I guess I forgot another one. Is F/A-18. The Marine F/A-18s are going to be just got certified to use the JASSM cruise missile, something that's got like 150-mile range, which is 270 kilometers, I think, something like that. It's very easy that the technologies, these and then you go into the automated warships that Project 33 is created. It seems like it really needs to ask the question, is as we start asked to sink more and more money and taking more and more time building the Ford class aircraft carriers, is it time for something else? I don't have the answer to it, but I think it's a debate that's worth considering. Would it be better having 25 smaller aircraft carriers and 5 giant carriers of the Ford class? Would that be better off than having 11 Ford class aircraft carriers or 10 Ford class and whatever the replacement, or 11 super carriers? would it be better to have something that's much more diversified, much harder to defeat just by being able to spread out your assets? I think it's something that's worth asking for, or something worth asking. And again, remember, any war, modern war, that's going to use weapons like this in the Western Pacific is going to be basically a come as you are war. That means basically what you start the war with is what you have to fight it with. And so if if you put all your baskets in a smaller number of aircraft carriers, is it the right decision in a modern warfare environment? And maybe it would be a lot easier to say, yeah, I think it's worth it. These things have been proven themselves, but there's still so many open questions about the Ford class carrier. It is definitely worth asking those questions before you commit to a program that has so far cost more and is still not even fulfilled the basic obligations of exceeding the abilities of the current Nimitz class aircraft carriers. All right, so that is my discussion. That is my rant for today. Again, I don't have the answer on the supercarrier question. I think it's just really asking, it's worth exploring? Is it time to start thinking of other options? So, all right, I went long. I knew this one was going to be long because 2 of those papers were actually long this week, so I had a lot to talk about. I have some changes at work I have to consider. I may have to drop that Wednesday paper, but I'll try to find something to fill in on that. We'll see. Maybe not do videos, make them shorter papers. I'm not sure. I got to think about that. We'll see. So anyway, I want to thank everybody. I run long, so I'm going to cut it off. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you for all the new listeners. Please consider providing support, becoming a paid member, or going to Ko-fi, Buy Me a Coffee, or Patreon to provide one-time support. Some of these papers that I pulled today this week actually cost me a little bit of money, so there is costs involved in doing this. So if I have the resources to be able to help pay for some of this, the more I can try to get into and start discussing more options. It kind of annoys me, but some of those think tank papers are better than what you can find in media sources, so it always helps. So I want to say thank you. I hope all of you have a great week. Reach out to me on Substack if you have any questions. I'm more than happy to debate. I'm happy to admit when I'm wrong. I'm happy to respectfully debate questions. So I hope all of you have a great week, and we'll talk to you next week. Bye.